The bank statement slipped from my trembling fingers and fluttered to the kitchen floor like a death sentence. $7 million. I stood there in my mother-in-law's empty house, surrounded by the thrift store furniture and yellowed doilies she'd clutched onto for 30 years, staring at numbers that made no sense. The same woman who'd let my children wear hand-me-downs from church donations. The same woman who'd watched me work 3 jobs to keep our lights on while she sat in her threadbare armchair, complaining about the cost of groceries. My knees buckled and I gripped the granite countertop, granite that I'd always assumed was some cheap imitation, but now I wondered what else had been a lie. The funeral was yesterday. We'd buried her in the dress I bought her from Walmart because she said she couldn't afford anything fancy. My husband cried over her casket, talking about how she'd sacrificed everything for family, how she'd lived so humbly, so selflessly. I pressed my palms against my eyes, but the tears came anyway. Angry tears. Bewildered tears. The kind that tastes like betrayal and burns your throat on the way down. 23 years. 23 years of marriage to her son, of watching her shake her head sadly when the kids needed school supplies, of her reluctantly accepting our help with her electric bill while she sat on enough money to buy the entire block. The paper was still there on the floor, accusatory in its stillness. Bank of America. Account holder, Margaret Eleanor Sullivan. Current balance, $7,247,893.42. How long had she been watching us struggle? The afternoon light slanted through her kitchen window, the same window where she'd stood countless times, washing dishes by hand because she claimed dishwashers were too expensive to run. The same kitchen where she'd served us watered-down coffee and stale cookies, apologizing for not having anything better. I bent down and picked up the statement with shaking hands, reading it again, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't. Margaret Eleanor Sullivan had been living a lie. And we had been living with her victims. If this story is already stirring something in your heart, I'd love to know. What time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. My name is Patricia, and I'm 54 years old as I tell you this story. I can feel every one of those years in my hands as I type this. Hands that are lined and spotted now, hands that have scrubbed floors and folded endless loads of laundry, hands that have held crying babies and wiped away more tears than I care to count. These hands remember the weight of every struggle, every sacrifice, every sleepless night spent wondering how we'd make it through another month. When I was 28 and newly married to David, I thought I was getting more than just a husband. I thought I was gaining a family. His mother, Margaret, seemed like the kind of woman who'd weathered life's storms with grace. She lived in a small ranch house on Maple Street, the same house where David had grown up, with its faded siding and the garden she tended with such care. She wore cardigans with small holes at the elbows and shoes that had been resold more times than seemed possible. I admired her then. God, how naive I was. There was something almost noble about the way she'd make a single chicken last 3 meals, how she'd darn socks instead of throwing them away, how she'd save every glass jar and rubber band just in case. She seemed like someone who understood the value of things, who'd learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed. The house always smelled like lavender and old books. She had this way of making you feel welcomed but also slightly guilty, like you were somehow too comfortable with modern conveniences she couldn't afford. She'd apologize for the thermostat being set so low in winter, for the black and white television that took 5 minutes to warm up, for the bathroom wallpaper that had been peeling since the Carter administration. I make do, she'd say with that soft smile that made you want to hug her and slip her a $20 bill. I remember those early years when David and I were building our life together. We'd bought a modest 2-bedroom house across town, nothing fancy, but it felt like a palace compared to Margaret's place. I'd catch her sometimes running her fingers along our laminate countertops like they were marble, admiring our little dishwasher like it was some space-age technology. "You young people have such nice things," she'd murmur, and the wistfulness in her voice would break my heart. I wanted so badly to help her. When our first child was born, little Emma, now 25 and married herself, Margaret would babysit for free because she said she enjoyed the company. She'd arrive with homemade blankets knitted from discount yarn and wooden toys she'd found at garage sales. Everything was secondhand, everything was mended, everything was offered with such love that I never questioned the simplicity of it all. I thought I knew her. I thought I understood sacrifice because I'd watched her live it every single day. I was wrong about everything. Margaret had been widowed when David was just 15. His father, Robert, had died in a construction accident. A story she told with the measured cadence of someone who'd recited it countless times. The insurance barely covered the funeral, she'd say whenever money came up in conversation. I've been making it work ever since. Making it work. That phrase became her anthem, her excuse, her shield against any suggestion that things could be different. I remember the first time David brought me to meet her, back when we were just dating. I was 22, fresh out of college and nervous about making a good impression. David had warned me that his mother lived simply, that money was tight, that I shouldn't expect anything fancy. The house on Maple Street was exactly what he'd described. Modest, aging but meticulously clean. Margaret answered the door wearing a cardigan that had clearly been darned multiple times, her gray hair pinned back with bobby pins that had lost their coating years ago. But her smile was warm, genuine, and she hugged me like I was already family. Come in, she said, ushering us into a living room that smelled of lavender and old books. I've made tea. I hope you don't mind the mismatched cups. I'm afraid my good china didn't survive the move after Robert died. The move. I later learned that Margaret had sold their family home after Robert's death, claiming she needed something smaller, more affordable. She downsized from a 4-bedroom colonial to this tiny ranch, explaining to anyone who'd listen that she simply couldn't manage the expenses on her own. David grew up believing his mother was heroic. He'd tell me stories about how she'd worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and taking in sewing during the day, to keep him in school. How she'd saved every penny so he could go to community college. How she'd driven a car held together with prayer and duct tape until he graduated and could help with expenses. She gave up everything for me, he'd say, and the guilt in his voice would make my chest ache. That guilt followed him into our marriage like a shadow. Every nice dinner we had, every vacation we took, every upgrade to our house felt like a betrayal of his mother's sacrifices. He'd send her money monthly, not much because we didn't have much, but $50 here, $100 there. Enough to help with groceries, enough to ease the worry lines on her forehead. She'd accept it with such reluctance, such shame. I hate taking this from you, she'd whisper, folding the bills into her worn purse. But the electric company doesn't care about my pride. How perfectly she played the part. I remember watching her hands as she folded those bills, hands that were soft despite all the hard work she claimed to do, nails that were always perfectly manicured despite her supposed poverty. She'd tell stories about scrubbing floors until her knees ached, but her hands told a different story. They were the hands of someone who'd never done hard labor, never scrubbed anything rougher than her own dishes. But I didn't see it then. I saw what she wanted me to see. When Emma was born, Margaret insisted on hand-knitting everything. Blankets, booties, tiny sweaters and soft pastels. Store-bought is so expensive, she'd explain, her needles clicking in the lamplight. Besides, these are made with love. I cherished those blankets. I thought they represented hours of selfless devotion, a grandmother pouring her heart into stitches because money was too tight for anything else. I'd show them off to other new mothers, talking about David's incredible mother who did so much with so little. But now I remember the yarn she used, soft, luxurious merino wool that cost $30 a skein at the craft store. I know because I'd seen it there, longed for it myself, but always chose the cheaper acrylic because that's what our budget allowed. Margaret's knitting needles were beautiful too, made of exotic hardwood with her initials engraved in gold script. Not the kind of tools you'd expect from someone scraping by on Social Security. The signs were there. We just didn't want to see them. Then came Kevin, our second child, 3 years later. Margaret repeated the ritual. More blankets, more booties, more stories about finding the yarn on clearance. By then we were struggling ourselves. David's salary from the warehouse barely covered our mortgage, and my part-time job at the bank wasn't much help. But we still sent Margaret her monthly check. I'll never forget the Christmas when Emma was 6 and Kevin was 3. We'd had a particularly tight year. My hours had been cut and David had missed 2 weeks of work with the flu. We'd managed to scrape together enough for modest gifts for the kids, but there wasn't much left over. Margaret arrived Christmas morning with presents wrapped in newspaper, apologizing for the presentation. I couldn't afford the fancy paper, she said, but her eyes were twinkling as the children tore into packages containing beautiful wooden toys. A dollhouse for Emma, a train set for Kevin. Mom, these are incredible, David breathed, examining the craftsmanship. Where did you find them? "Oh, you know me," she said with that self-deprecating laugh. "I have my ways. Estate sales, thrift shops. Sometimes you get lucky." The toys were pristine. Museum quality really. Hand-carved details, perfectly fitted joints, the kind of craftsmanship that cost hundreds of dollars. Emma's dollhouse even had tiny working lights powered by a hidden battery pack. Kevin's train set was solid hardwood with brass fittings. But we were so grateful, so moved by her generosity despite her circumstances, that we never questioned how someone on a fixed income could afford such treasures. We told ourselves she'd gotten impossibly lucky, found some incredible deals, maybe even traded services for goods. We never questioned anything. The dollhouse became Emma's most treasured possession. She'd spend hours arranging the miniature furniture, creating elaborate stories about the tiny family who lived there. Sometimes I'd find her having tea parties with her grandmother, both of them sitting on the floor beside that beautiful dollhouse, Margaret listening with rapt attention to Emma's imaginative tales. "Grandma says imagination is more valuable than money," Emma would tell me solemnly. "She says rich people are usually boring because they can just buy everything instead of making it up." Even then, Margaret was poisoning my daughter against the idea of wealth. Even then, she was justifying her own cruelty as virtue. As the years passed, Margaret's struggles seemed to intensify. The house needed a new roof. She showed us the buckets catching drips in the hallway. The furnace was making concerning noises. The car needed repairs that cost more than it was worth. Each crisis brought the same pattern. Margaret would mention it casually, David would worry himself sick, and we'd find a way to help. Sometimes it meant skipping our own repairs. Sometimes it meant the kids wearing last year's clothes a little longer. "But family comes first," David would say. "She sacrificed for us. Now we sacrifice for her." I remember the day she called about the roof. It was a Thursday afternoon and I was folding laundry when the phone rang. Margaret's voice was shaky, apologetic. "I'm so sorry to bother you, dear," she said. "But I think I have a real problem here." David and I drove over immediately. Margaret led us through the house, pointing out water stains on the ceiling, buckets strategically placed to catch drips. She'd even put towels down to protect her furniture. "The roofer says it'll cost $3,000 to fix," she said, wringing her hands. "I just don't have that kind of money. I suppose I'll have to wait until next year, hope it holds up through winter." The despair in her voice was so genuine, so heartbreaking. David and I exchanged glances and I knew we were thinking the same thing. We just put aside $2,000 for a vacation. Our first real family trip in years. But how could we go to the beach while Margaret's ceiling was falling in? "Don't worry about it, Mom," David said, pulling her into a hug. "We'll take care of it." We canceled our vacation. We gave her our savings. And she took it with tears of gratitude that I now know were completely fake. When Kevin started high school, he needed equipment for football. Margaret heard about it and shook her head sadly. "I wish I could help," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "But you know how tight things are. The equipment cost $600. Shoulder pads, helmet, cleats, practice gear." Kevin had worked all summer mowing lawns and doing odd jobs, saving every penny, but he was still $200 short. Margaret listened to our dilemma with such obvious pain. "If I were a better grandmother," she said, her eyes filling with tears, "I'd be able to help him chase his dreams. But I can barely keep my own lights on." We took out a small loan to cover the costs. David worked overtime for 3 months to pay it back, coming home exhausted every night, his back aching from the extra shifts at the warehouse. Kevin never knew about the loan. He thought his parents had simply found the money and he was so grateful, so determined to make the most of his opportunity. He threw himself into football with the kind of passion that only comes from knowing how much sacrifice went into making something possible. He was good. Really good. Good enough that scouts started calling during his junior year. But athletic scholarships require more than just talent. They require specialized training, summer camps, travel teams, all things that cost money we didn't have. Kevin understood this without us ever having to say it directly. He'd watch other players talking about their private trainers and showcase tournaments, and his face would close off in that way teenagers' faces do when they're learning hard lessons about how the world works. Margaret would shake her head sadly whenever the subject came up. "Such a shame," she'd murmur. "That boy has so much potential. She could have sent him to every camp in the country. She could have hired the best trainers money could buy. Instead, she watched him give up his dreams piece by piece. When Emma graduated and wanted to go to a 4-year university, Margaret sat in our living room with tears in her eyes. "I feel so helpless," she whispered. "I always dreamed of helping with college costs, but—" She gestured helplessly at her threadbare sweater, her worn shoes. Emma had been accepted to 3 universities, including her dream school, a prestigious liberal arts college where she wanted to study literature. The tuition was astronomical, but Emma had earned partial scholarships based on her grades and test scores. We needed to cover $20,000 a year, though, and that was simply impossible. "I understand, Grandma," Emma said, sitting beside Margaret on the couch and taking her hand. "Money doesn't grow on trees. But for Margaret it might as well have. She had enough money growing in interest to pay for Emma's entire education without ever touching the principal. Emma ended up at community college instead. It's better anyway," she said with the kind of maturity that broke my heart. "Grandma taught me that money isn't everything. I'll get my education either way." Grandma taught her all right. The irony is that I loved Margaret during those years. I genuinely, deeply loved her. I admired her resilience, her grace under pressure, her ability to find joy in small things. I bragged about her to my friends. This remarkable woman who'd raised such a good man despite having so little. I invited her to every birthday party, every school play, every family gathering. I made sure she felt included, valued, essential to our lives. When she'd apologize for not bringing expensive gifts, I'd hug her and tell her that her presence was the only present we needed. She'd smile and pat my cheek with those soft, papery hands. "You're such a good girl, Patricia," she'd say. "David is lucky to have you." Lucky. I remember Emma's 16th birthday party. We'd planned a small celebration at home, just family and a few close friends. Margaret arrived with a gift wrapped in brown paper bags taped together, obviously embarrassed by the presentation. "I'm sorry it's not prettier," she apologized as Emma carefully unwrapped it. "But I thought you might like this." Inside was a vintage camera. A beautiful 35mm Nikon with multiple lenses and a leather case. Emma gasped with delight. She'd been interested in photography but had never been able to afford anything more sophisticated than a disposable camera. "Grandma, this is amazing," Emma exclaimed, turning the camera over in her hands. "Where did you find it?" "Oh, you know," Margaret said with that familiar self-deprecating wave. "I have my ways. Sometimes people don't know what they're getting rid of. That camera was worth at least $1,000. I know because I looked it up later, curious about its value. It wasn't some lucky thrift store find. It was a carefully chosen, expensive gift that she could easily afford. But she presented it like a miracle, like some incredible stroke of luck that had allowed her to give her granddaughter something special despite her poverty. And we bought it completely. I remember the afternoon she had her first minor stroke. David and I rushed to the hospital, terrified we might lose her. She looked so small in that hospital bed, so fragile, and I held her hand while David paced the room like a caged animal. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered to me when he stepped out to call work. "I know you young people have their own lives." "You're not a burden," I insisted, squeezing her fingers. "You're family." The hospital stay lasted 3 days. Margaret worried constantly about the cost even though Medicare covered most of it. "I should have stayed home," she fretted. "Hospitals are so expensive." She could have stayed in the presidential suite for a month. She could have hired private nurses around the clock. Instead, she lay there fretting about co-pays that wouldn't have made a dent in her weekly interest income. The doctor said she needed to move to assisted living, something safer with medical supervision. Margaret's face crumpled. "I can't afford one of those fancy places," she said. "I'll just have to manage at home." We spent weeks researching affordable options, touring facilities that made our hearts sink. The cheaper places were depressing. Understaffed, overcrowded, filled with the smell of disinfectant and despair. The nicer facilities cost more than our mortgage payment. David was ready to move her in with us, to turn our dining room into a bedroom if necessary. "She took care of me when I couldn't take care of myself," he said. "Now it's my turn." But Margaret refused. "I won't disrupt your family," she said with quiet dignity. "I'll make do." Make do. Always making do. In the end, we found a modest facility across town. Not the worst we'd seen, but far from the best. The monthly cost was more than our mortgage, but David was determined. "She raised me," he said. Now it's my turn. We refinanced the house to cover the payments, extending our mortgage by 10 years, pushing our retirement date further into an uncertain future. Margaret moved in with such grace, such gratitude. She thanked us 1,000 times, promised she'd find a way to pay us back somehow, someday. She decorated her small room with the same thrift store treasures, the same carefully mended quilts. It's perfect, she said, though I could see her wiping away tears when she thought no one was looking. Perfect. A cramped room in a mediocre facility when she could have afforded the finest care in the country. For 2 years she lived there peacefully. We visited every Sunday, brought the grandchildren, and listened to her stories about the other residents. She seemed content, almost happy. She made friends with her roommate, an elderly woman named Betty whose family rarely visited. Margaret would share the cookies I brought, help Betty with her crossword puzzles, listen to stories about Betty's late husband and the children who'd moved too far away to visit regularly. Betty's family sends money, Margaret told me one Sunday. But they never send themselves. Money can't replace love, can it, dear? The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Even then, even while living off our sacrifices, she was lecturing about the meaninglessness of money. She died in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in April. No pain, the nurses said. Just slipped away peacefully. We mourned her like the saint we believed her to be. The first shock came 3 days after the funeral, when I volunteered to help David clean out Margaret's room at the assisted living facility. It should have been simple. Pack up her clothes for donation, box up the photos and few keepsakes for the family, dispose of the rest. Margaret had lived so simply, owned so little, that we figured it would take an afternoon. I remember that morning so clearly. The April air was still crisp, carrying the scent of blooming daffodils from the facility's garden. David had been quiet during the drive, lost in memories of his mother. I'd packed empty boxes in the trunk, along with trash bags and tissue paper for wrapping the few precious items we'd keep. The nurses greeted us with genuine sympathy. They'd all loved Margaret, talked about how gracious she'd been, how she'd never complained about anything. She was always so grateful for everything, said Nancy, the head nurse. Even when we had to increase her medication costs, she'd just smile and say she was blessed to have such good care. Medication costs. Insurance copays that would have been pocket change to her. But when David opened the small safe she kept in her closet, we'd found the combination written in her address book under emergency numbers. He went completely white. "Patricia," he whispered, his voice strange and tight. "Look at this." Inside the safe were documents. Not just any documents, property deeds. Multiple property deeds. And bank statements. Lots of bank statements. My hands shook as I picked up the first deed. It was for a duplex on the other side of town, purchased in 1987 for $45,000. According to the attached property assessment, it was now worth over $200,000. I'd never heard Margaret mention owning any property besides her own house. The second deed was for a small commercial building downtown, purchased in 1992 for $78,000. The third was for another rental property, this one acquired in 1995 for $62,000. Each property had thick files attached. Rental agreements, maintenance records, property tax payments spanning decades. 3 properties. 3 rental properties we knew nothing about. "This has to be a mistake," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was staring at a bank statement from a credit union I'd never heard of, Plains Financial Services. The balance showed $127,843.67. "David," I said quietly, my stomach starting to churn. "This statement is from last month." We sat on her narrow bed, the bed with the hospital corner she'd insisted on making every morning, the bed she'd claimed was just fine despite the lumpy mattress, and went through document after document. Rental agreements dating back 30 years. Property tax payments that showed she'd owned these buildings since David was a teenager. Investment portfolios with companies I recognized. Microsoft, Apple, Google. Purchased when they were still growing. Margaret hadn't been poor. She hadn't even been middle class. Margaret had been wealthy. The room seemed to spin around me. I remembered every conversation about money, every apology for not being able to help, every time we'd scraped together extra cash to support her. My throat felt like it was closing. "There has to be an explanation," David kept saying, but he'd stopped looking through the papers. He was just sitting there holding a stock portfolio statement that showed holdings worth over $300,000. $300,000 in stocks. While we'd refinanced our house to pay for her care. I found myself thinking about all the little things, how Margaret had always insisted on splitting checks at restaurants, claiming she was on a fixed income. How she'd clip coupons religiously, making a show of adding up savings at the grocery store. How she'd turn down thermostats and wear sweaters indoors, apologizing for being such a penny pincher. It had all been theater. Every single moment of it. I thought about Emma working 2 jobs to pay for community college while living at home to save money. I thought about Kevin, who'd given up his dream of playing college football because we couldn't afford the equipment and training camps. I thought about our refinanced house, the money we'd borrowed to pay for Margaret's assisted living care, the retirement funds we'd raided for family emergencies. The care she could have paid for herself 100 times over. In the bottom of the safe, David found something that made him go completely still. It was a small leather journal, the kind with a tiny lock that wouldn't keep out anyone who really wanted to read it. The lock was broken, had been for years judging by the rust. "Patricia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She kept a diary. We opened it together, and the first entry was dated just 2 months after Robert's death. Margaret's careful handwriting filled page after page, documenting not just her daily activities, but her thoughts, her plans, her elaborate justifications for what she was about to do. David is 17 now, old enough to understand sacrifice but young enough to learn from it. Robert left us more than comfortable. The insurance alone would have set us up for life. But I've seen what easy money does to young people. It makes them soft, entitled, ungrateful for the things that really matter. I've decided to hide the money. All of it. David needs to learn the value of hard work, the satisfaction that comes from earning your own way. If he knows about Robert's nest egg, he'll never develop the character he needs to be a good man. The entries continued year after year, documenting her performance. She wrote about practicing expressions of worry in the mirror. She wrote about researching the right kind of second-hand furniture to buy, the right level of shabbiness for her clothes. She wrote about calculating exactly how much struggle would build character without causing real damage. She planned it all. Every single detail. When we got home that evening, David locked himself in the garage. I could hear him out there throwing things, cursing, crying. The kids asked what was wrong, but I couldn't find words. How do you explain that everything you believed about someone was a lie? I made dinner on autopilot, my hands going through familiar motions while my mind reeled. When David finally came inside, his eyes were red and his knuckles were scraped. There was sawdust in his hair from punching the workbench. "We need to see everything," he said quietly. "All of it." The next morning, we drove to Margaret's house. The house we'd helped her maintain for years. The house with the leaky roof and the failing furnace. David still had keys. As her only child, he'd inherited everything. Walking through that house felt like entering a crime scene. Everything looked the same. The mismatched furniture, the worn carpets, the outdated appliances. But now I was seeing it differently. The furniture wasn't mismatched because she couldn't afford better. It was a carefully constructed set piece. The worn carpets weren't proof of poverty. They were props in an elaborate performance. I ran my fingers along the kitchen counter, remembering how Margaret had always apologized for the scratched laminate. "Someday I'll be able to replace this," she'd say with a wistful sigh. But underneath the sink, David found a folder full of contractor estimates. For granite countertops, hardwood floors, stainless steel appliances. All dated within the past 2 years. All marked approved in Margaret's handwriting, then crossed out with angry red pen. She'd been planning renovations. She'd been planning to live in luxury. Just not while we could see it. David headed straight for her bedroom while I wandered through the living room in a daze. I picked up the photo of Robert, Margaret's deceased husband, and studied his face. Had he been part of this? Had he known what she was planning? In the bedroom, David was going through her dresser drawers with the methodical intensity of a detective. He found more bank statements, more investment records, more evidence of the lie she'd been living. Hidden behind a false back in the bottom drawer was another journal, this one covering the years of our marriage. David brought Patricia to dinner tonight. Such a sweet girl and clearly from a modest background. Perfect. She'll help reinforce the lessons I'm trying to teach him about the value of simple living. They're expecting their first child. I've been knitting baby clothes and pretending I can barely afford the yarn. Patricia was so touched by this sacrifice. If she only knew I could buy out the entire craft store. David sent another check today. $50 he can't afford to give. But watching him choose family over his own comfort, that's what real character looks like. Robert would be so proud. Patricia, he called, his voice hollow. Come here. He was holding a manila folder marked rental income, in Margaret's careful handwriting. Inside were records going back 30 years. Detailed logs of monthly payments from tenants, property management fees, maintenance costs, tax calculations. And more journal entries, documenting her feelings about each financial decision we made. They refinanced the house to help with my care costs. I should feel guilty, but I'm actually proud of them. This is exactly what Robert would have wanted. Our son choosing love over money, sacrifice over selfishness. Emma got into her dream school but decided to go to community college instead. Patricia cried when she told me, thinking I didn't notice. But Emma is learning that dreams don't come easy, that education means more when you work for it. Another victory. Kevin gave up football today. David tried to hide his disappointment, but I could see it. Good. Now Kevin will focus on academics, on building a future with his mind instead of his body. Sports scholarships are for children who've had everything handed to them. She'd been collecting rental income from 3 properties for decades. Based on the numbers I was seeing, she'd been bringing in at least $2,000 a month in passive income alone. More than David made working full-time at the warehouse. $2,000 a month. Money that could have paid for Emma's university education. Money that could have bought Kevin the training he needed for his football scholarship dreams. Money that could have kept us from refinancing our house into our 60s. But the worst was yet to come. Hidden in the bottom of her jewelry box. The same box she'd claimed contained only worthless costume pieces inherited from her mother. David found a small key. It took us 20 minutes to figure out what it opened. A safety deposit box at First National Bank. The drive to the bank was silent. David gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, and I stared out the window at the ordinary suburban streets where we'd lived our ordinary suburban life, never knowing we were being watched, judged, evaluated by someone who held our fate in her hands. The bank manager, a woman named Mrs. Henderson who'd known Margaret for years, offered her condolences as she led us to the vault. Such a sweet lady, she said. So modest, always worried about the cost of everything. I used to tell her she didn't need to be so concerned about the box rental fee, but she'd just smile and say every penny mattered. Every penny mattered. While she was sitting on millions. The safety deposit box was large, much larger than I'd expected. Mrs. Henderson left us alone with it, and David turned the key with hands that had started shaking again. Inside were stacks of cash. Actual, physical cash, rubber-banded in neat bundles. I'd never seen so much money in one place outside of a movie. There had to be at least $50,000, maybe more. The bills were crisp, new, like she'd been regularly exchanging old money for fresh currency. Underneath the cash were more documents. Life insurance policies. Multiple life insurance policies, each worth $100,000 or more. Investment certificates from companies I'd never heard of. Municipal bonds. Treasury bills. A stock portfolio that made the one we'd found at her house look like pocket change. And then, at the very bottom, David found something that made him stop breathing entirely. A will. A real will, notarized and official, completely different from the simple document her lawyer had filed with the court. David picked up the real will with trembling hands. As he read it, his face went from white to gray to a sickly green color I'd never seen before. She left it all to charity, he whispered. All of it. Every property, every bank account, every investment, every policy. All of it was being donated to various charities. The Salvation Army, Goodwill, the local food bank, the Children's Hospital. Organizations that helped families in need. Families in need. Like the family she'd watched struggle for 23 years while she sat on millions of dollars. But there was more. Attached to the will was a letter. Not just one letter, but several, each dated differently, each representing different stages of her planning. The first letter was written shortly after Robert's death. I know this will be hard to understand, but everything I'm doing is for love. Money corrupts. I've seen it happen to so many families. Sudden wealth turning children into lazy, entitled monsters who never learn the value of anything because everything is always free. The second letter was dated 10 years later. David is doing so well. He's learned to work hard, to value family, and to make sacrifices for others. Patricia is perfect for him. She understands struggle, understands that love is more important than money. I'm so proud of the man he's become. The third letter was dated just 5 years ago. The grandchildren are growing up beautifully. Emma is so responsible, so mature. She doesn't expect everything to be handed to her like so many young people today. Kevin is learning that dreams require sacrifice, that nothing worthwhile comes easy. They're both going to be such good people because they've learned these lessons young. And the final letter, dated just 6 months before her death. My dear David, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you have discovered my secret. I know you must be confused, perhaps even angry, and I want you to understand why I lived as I did. When your father died, he left us well provided for. The life insurance, the investments, the properties, they were his way of ensuring we'd never want for anything. But I watched what money did to my own parents, how it made them lazy and entitled, how it robbed them of the satisfaction that comes from earning your own way. I didn't want that for you. I didn't want you to grow up soft, dependent, expecting everything to be handed to you. I wanted you to learn the value of work, the pride that comes from making your own success. I wanted you to be strong. Everything I did for love. Every sacrifice you made, every dollar you earned, every obstacle you overcame, those experiences made you the man you are today. A good man. A strong man. A man your father would be proud of. The money I've saved will go to people who truly need it, people who don't have families like ours to help them. But you, my darling boy, you have something more valuable than money. You have character. I pray that someday you'll understand. I pray that you'll forgive me. All my love, Mother. David crumpled the letter in his fist and made a sound I'd never heard before. Part sob, part roar, part something breaking deep inside his chest. I wanted to comfort him, but I couldn't. I was drowning in my own rage, my own sense of betrayal. She'd done it for love? She'd watched my children go without love? She'd let us struggle and scrimp and sacrifice for love? The bank manager knocked softly on the door. Take all the time you need, she said, but I could hear the question in her voice. Normal people don't spend hours crying in a safety deposit box vault. We sat there among Margaret's hidden fortune, two people whose entire understanding of their family had just been shattered. David kept reading the letter over and over like he was trying to find some hidden meaning that would make it all make sense. I thought about every birthday party where Margaret had apologized for her modest gifts. Every Christmas where she'd wrapped presents in newspaper and old grocery bags. Every time she'd accepted our money with that perfect expression of grateful reluctance. It had all been an act. Every single moment of 23 years had been a performance. 23 years of marriage, and my husband's mother had been playing a role the entire time. The humble widow, the struggling grandmother, the woman who made do with so little. It was all performance art, and we'd been her unwitting audience. But the cruelest part wasn't the deception itself. It was the letter. It was Margaret's absolute conviction that she'd done the right thing. That watching us struggle had been a gift. That denying our children opportunities had been an act of love. She'd been proud of what she'd done. She died believing she was a saint. As we finally packed up the contents of the safety deposit box, I thought about Emma, now 25 and still paying off student loans from the master's degree she'd had to finance herself. I thought about Kevin, who'd given up his athletic dreams and was now working construction, his back already showing signs of strain at 22. I thought about the dreams we'd deferred, the vacations we'd never taken, the security we'd never felt because we were always helping Margaret make do. And I thought about Margaret herself, sitting in that assisted living facility for 2 years, letting us pay for her care while she had enough money to buy the entire building. How had she stood it? How had she looked us in the eye every Sunday when we visited, knowing what she was hiding? How had she accepted our money, our sacrifice, our genuine concern for her welfare, all while sitting on a fortune that could have changed all our lives? When we left the bank that day, David and I drove home in complete silence. What was there to say? How do you process the discovery that someone you loved was a stranger? How do you mourn someone who'd been lying to you for decades? That night, Emma called to check on us. How are you doing with Grandma's stuff? She asked, her voice soft with sympathy. I know it must be hard going through her things. David couldn't speak, so I took the call. I looked at my husband sitting at our kitchen table with his head in his hands, and I made a decision. It's been difficult, I told Emma. But we're managing. We're managing. Just like Margaret always had. Just like she taught us to do. I couldn't tell Emma the truth. Not yet. Maybe not ever. How do you destroy a young woman's memories of her beloved grandmother? How do you explain that the woman who taught her about thrift and humility had been one of the most selfish people we'd ever known? But I knew that eventually we'd have to face the truth. All of it. And I knew that Margaret's gift to us, her lesson in character building through struggle, was going to be the thing that tore our family apart. Because David blamed himself. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he kept rereading that letter. He was trying to find a way to make it his fault, to make Margaret's deception into his own failure. And I blamed her. I blamed her completely, utterly, with a rage that scared me in its intensity. How do you forgive someone who's dead? How do you have it out with someone who can't defend themselves, can't explain themselves, can't beg for forgiveness or promise to make things right? Margaret had engineered the perfect crime. She'd stolen 23 years of honesty from our family, and then she died, leaving us to wrestle with the wreckage alone. But the worst part, the part that kept me awake at night, was the growing suspicion that she'd known exactly what she was doing. That every struggle she'd watched us endure had been deliberate. That every sacrifice she'd let us make had been calculated. That she died believing she was a good person. That she'd enjoyed watching us suffer. The call came on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Margaret's funeral. I was making coffee, going through the motions of a normal day while David sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. He'd barely spoken since we'd discovered the truth about his mother, and the silence in our house had become suffocating. "Mrs. Sullivan?" The voice on the phone was crisp, professional. "This is Janet Morrison from Morrison, Bailey and Associates. I'm calling about your late mother-in-law's estate." I handed the phone to David, but he just shook his head. He couldn't handle any more revelations about Margaret. So I took the call myself. "I'm Patricia Sullivan, David's wife," I said. "What can I help you with?" "Well, there seems to be some confusion about Mrs. Sullivan's will," Janet said. "The document that was filed with the court appears to be outdated. We've been contacted by several charities who claim they were named as beneficiaries in a more recent will." My stomach dropped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to meet. There are some significant discrepancies that need to be resolved. Can you and your husband come in this afternoon?" The law office was downtown, in one of those historic buildings with marble floors and mahogany paneling that screamed expensive. Janet Morrison was a woman about my age, with silver hair and kind eyes that couldn't quite hide her discomfort. "I'm not sure how to tell you this," she began, spreading documents across the polished conference table. "But the will that was filed after your mother-in-law's death wasn't her final will." She showed us the document we'd found in the safety deposit box, the one that left everything to charity. It was dated 6 months after the will her original lawyer had on file. "This is her real will," Janet said quietly. "The legal will. The one that supersedes everything else." David finally spoke, his voice hoarse from weeks of not talking. "So she really did leave it all to charity?" "Not exactly," Janet said, and she looked genuinely sorry about what she had to say next. "There's more." She pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a private investigation firm. "Your mother-in-law hired investigators 3 years ago. Had you followed, Mr. Sullivan? Your entire family followed." "I don't understand," I whispered, but part of me was already starting to. Janet opened the file, revealing photographs. Pictures of David at work. Pictures of me at the grocery store. Pictures of Emma at college, Kevin at football practice. Pictures of our house, our cars, our daily lives. "She was documenting your financial situation," Janet explained. "Every purchase, every expense, every financial decision. She wanted proof that you were living within your means, that you weren't being frivolous." The room felt like it was tilting. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to understand what I was hearing. "There are detailed reports here," Janet continued, flipping through pages of typed observations. "Notes about your grocery shopping habits, the clothes you bought for the children, the condition of your house and vehicles. She was evaluating you." David made that broken sound again, the same one he'd made when he read her letter. But this time it was worse. This time it was the sound of something dying. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why would she do that?" Janet looked down at the file, clearly uncomfortable. According to the notes in her personal papers, she was planning to change her will again. "You had Passed her test. If you had proven yourselves worthy. Worthy. But you didn't, she said so quietly I almost didn't hear her. According to her final notes made just 2 weeks before she died, you had failed to meet her standards. She pulled out a handwritten document, Margaret's careful script filling the page. She writes here that you had become too comfortable, that you had lost sight of what truly matters. She specifically mentions the granite countertops you installed last year, the vacation you took to Florida, the new car you bought for Emma when she graduated. I remembered that countertop installation. We'd saved for 2 years to replace the damaged laminate. The vacation had been our first real family trip in 5 years, funded by David's overtime pay and my tax refund. Emma's car was a used Honda with 150,000 miles on it. None of it had been extravagant. She felt that giving you money would only make you more materialistic, Janet continued. Her final notes say that you needed to learn the value of struggle before you could be trusted with wealth. The absurdity of it hit me like a physical blow. We'd been living under surveillance, being judged for buying necessities while Margaret sat on millions of dollars. We'd been failing tests we didn't know we were taking. How long? David asked, his voice barely audible. How long was she planning this? Janet consulted the file. According to these documents, she began planning this test shortly after your father died. She'd been watching and evaluating your family for over 20 years. 20 years. Our entire marriage had been a performance, and we'd been unaware actors in Margaret's twisted play. Every financial decision we'd made had been scrutinized, judged, found wanting by a woman who had the power to end our struggles with a single check. There's one more thing, Janet said, and I didn't think I could take any more revelations. She left video messages. Multiple video messages recorded over the past 3 years. She intended for them to be played after her death as part of the will reading. She gestured to a laptop on the credenza. The first one is addressed to you both. Would you like to see it? I looked at David. His face was gray, his hands trembling. But he nodded. Janet clicked play and Margaret's face filled the screen. She was sitting in her living room, our living room where we'd spent countless Sunday afternoons, where she'd served us watered-down coffee and accepted our charity with such grace. Hello, my dear children, she began, and her voice was exactly the same. Warm, grandmotherly, loving. Lying. If you're watching this, then you've discovered my secret and you know about the test. I want you to understand that everything I did was out of love for you and for my grandchildren. She leaned forward, her eyes sincere, her expression maternal. David, my darling boy, I know you must be confused. But think about the man you've become. Think about your work ethic, your values, your commitment to family. Would you be the same person if you'd grown up with money? Would Patricia love you the same way if you hadn't had to struggle for everything you've achieved? I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something at the screen. But I sat frozen, listening to this woman justify 23 years of deception. I've watched you raise those beautiful children with such care, such attention to what truly matters. Emma is studying hard because she knows education isn't free. Kevin has learned discipline from sports because he understands that nothing worthwhile comes easily. These are gifts, my precious ones. These are the gifts I gave you. Gifts. Margaret smiled at the camera, the same smile she'd given us every Sunday for over 2 decades. I know you'll be angry at first. That's natural. But someday when you're my age you'll understand. You'll see that money corrupts, that struggle builds character, that the greatest love sometimes looks like cruelty. The video continued for another 10 minutes, Margaret explaining her philosophy, her reasoning, her absolute conviction that she'd done the right thing. She talked about watching us from a distance, about being proud of our resilience, about how our struggles had proven we were good people. Good people who deserved to struggle. When it ended, the room was silent except for the sound of David crying. Not the quiet tears of grief, but the harsh, ugly sobs of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. I stared at the blank screen, feeling something hard and cold settling in my chest. This wasn't grief anymore. This wasn't even anger. This was something much darker. Because in that moment, watching Margaret's self-satisfied explanation of her cruelty, I realized something that made my blood run cold. She'd enjoyed it. Every moment of our struggle, every sacrifice we'd made, every time we'd worried about money while she watched from the sidelines, she'd enjoyed all of it. She'd died happy, convinced she was a saint. And we were left here in this marble and mahogany room, holding the pieces of our shattered faith in family, in love, in the very idea that people can be who they seem to be. David looked up at me, his face streaked with tears. "What do we do now?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. How do you heal from something like this? How do you trust anyone again when the person you trusted most was capable of such elaborate deception? How do you explain to your children that their beloved grandmother had been testing them their entire lives, finding them unworthy of the love she'd pretended to give freely? How do you forgive the unforgivable? The months that followed were the hardest of our marriage. David fell into a depression so deep I wasn't sure he'd ever surface. He'd sit for hours staring at Margaret's letter, trying to find some interpretation that would make it all make sense. He'd analyze every memory, every conversation, every interaction, searching for clues he'd missed. "I should have known," he'd say over and over. How could I not have known? How could he have known? She'd been a master manipulator for over 20 years. I wanted to comfort him, but I was struggling with my own demons. The rage I felt toward Margaret was consuming me, eating away at everything good in my life. I'd find myself shaking with anger at random moments, standing in the grocery store folding laundry trying to fall asleep. The injustice of it all was overwhelming. She'd stolen our peace. Even in death, Margaret was controlling our lives, destroying our happiness, making us question everything we thought we knew about love and family and truth. The first few weeks were a blur of lawyers and paperwork. Margaret's will had to be probated, which meant the charitable bequests became public record. Suddenly everyone in town knew that the poor widow on Maple Street had been sitting on a fortune. The reactions were varied and painful. Some people were sympathetic, understanding that we'd been victims of an elaborate deception. Others seemed to think we should have known that we were either incredibly naive or somehow complicit in Margaret's lies. "I always wondered how she managed to give such nice gifts," said Mrs. Peterson from down the street. "I mean, that dollhouse she made for Emma? You could tell it cost a fortune. Could you? Why didn't we see it?" The hardest part was dealing with the kids. We couldn't keep it from them forever. Too many people knew, and small towns have a way of making secrets public. But how do you explain something like this to your children? How do you destroy their memories of Sunday dinners and hand-knitted blankets and bedtime stories? Emma figured it out first. She came over one evening in late summer, almost 4 months after Margaret's funeral, and found David in the garage again, surrounded by boxes of his mother's belongings. "Dad," she said quietly, "what's really going on? And don't tell me you're just grieving. I know what grief looks like, and this isn't it." I was in the kitchen when I heard David break down and tell her everything. Her shocked silence, then her questions, then her tears. My 25-year-old daughter crying for the grandmother she thought she'd known, mourning a relationship that had never been real. She watched me struggle through college. Emma's voice was small, broken. She watched me work 2 jobs and live on ramen noodles, and she could have helped the entire time. David tried to explain Margaret's letter, her philosophy about character building and the corruption of easy money. But Emma just shook her head. "That's not character building, Dad. That's just cruel." Yes, I wanted to say. Yes, it was. Kevin was harder to tell. He was angry in a way that scared me, angry like I'd never seen him before. "She watched me give up football," he said, his voice tight with fury. "She sat there and watched me give up my dreams because we couldn't afford training, and she had millions of dollars?" He'd been working construction for 3 years by then, his body already showing the wear and tear of physical labor. His knees ached in the mornings, his back was constantly sore, and his hands were permanently stained and calloused. "I could have gone to college," he said. "I could have played football, gotten a scholarship, studied something I actually cared about. Instead, I'm destroying my body for $12 an hour because Grandma thought struggle builds character." Yes, I wanted to say. She stole your future for her philosophy. But saying it out loud would have made it more real, more final, more damaging than it already was. The worst part was watching David blame himself for his children's pain. "I should have protected them from this," he'd say. "I should have seen through her lies." But how could he have? How could any of us have? Margaret had been a master manipulator, so skilled at her deception that even professional investigators wouldn't have detected it without access to her financial records. She'd studied us like lab rats, documenting our behavior, judging our choices, deciding our fate based on criteria we'd never been told about. We'd been living in a psychological experiment without our knowledge or consent. For 23 years. The legal proceedings took another 6 months. Margaret's Betrayal will stood. Everything went to charity just as she'd planned. The house, the rental properties, the bank accounts, the investments. All of it was distributed to organizations that helped families in need. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. David and I went to counseling both together and separately. Our therapist, Dr. Williams, was a kind woman in her 60s who specialized in family trauma. She helped me understand that my anger was normal, even healthy. "You've experienced a profound betrayal," she said during one of our sessions. "Not just financial but emotional and psychological. Your grief is complicated by the fact that the person you're mourning never really existed. Never really existed. That was the hardest part to accept. The Margaret we'd loved, humble, sacrificing, grateful for our help, had been a fiction. The real Margaret was someone else entirely. Calculating, judgmental, cruel in her certainty that she knew what was best for everyone else. But I loved her," I told Dr. Williams. "I genuinely, deeply loved her. How do I reconcile that with what she did to us?" "You loved who you thought she was," Dr. Williams replied gently. "That love was real even if the person wasn't. It's okay to grieve for the grandmother you thought you had while being angry at the woman she actually was. Permission to feel both love and rage. Permission to hold contradictory emotions." Dr. Williams helped David work through his guilt, his sense of failure as a son and husband and father. She helped him see that being deceived doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. "Trusting people is not a character flaw," she told him. "Even when that trust is betrayed. Your mother spent decades perfecting her deception. She had the advantage of your love, your respect, your assumption that family members tell the truth. You weren't naive, you were normal." Slowly, painfully, we began to rebuild. We had to create new family traditions, new ways of being together that weren't tainted by Margaret's surveillance and judgment. We had to learn to make financial decisions without the weight of imaginary eyes watching and evaluating our choices. For months, every purchase felt loaded with significance. When we bought new furniture to replace our worn couch, I found myself wondering what Margaret would have thought. When we took a weekend trip to visit friends, I imagined her disapproval, her notes about our frivolous spending. She was dead, but she was still controlling us. Emma changed her last name when she got married 6 months later. She said she wanted a fresh start, a clean break from the family history that had turned out to be built on lies. I understood, but it broke my heart anyway. Her wedding was small, intimate, and beautiful. But there was an empty chair where Margaret should have sat, and we all felt it. Not grief for the woman who died, but grief for the woman we'd thought we'd known, the grandmother who should have been there to cry happy tears and fuss over the flowers. Kevin started seeing a counselor who specializes in helping young adults process family trauma. He'd lost not just his grandmother but his faith in family loyalty, his belief that love means putting others first. Those were harder losses than the money ever could have been. Money can be earned back. Trust, once shattered, is almost impossible to rebuild. He started taking night classes at the community college, using his construction wages to pay for courses in business and accounting. "I'm not going to let her win," he told me one evening. "I'm not going to let her take my entire future. My brave boy. My strong, determined son who refused to let Margaret's cruelty define him." David and I made it through, but we're different now. There's a wariness in both of us that wasn't there before, a tendency to question, to look for hidden motives, to wonder what people aren't telling us. We've learned to live with the knowledge that someone can love you and hurt you simultaneously, that good intentions can mask terrible cruelty, that the people closest to you are capable of the deepest betrayals. We've learned that love and abuse can wear the same face. 2 years later, I still think about Margaret every day. Not the Margaret we thought we knew, but the real one. The one who sat in that assisted living facility, accepting our visits and our payments while knowing exactly what she was putting us through. I think about her watching us struggle and feeling satisfied with our character development. I think about her writing in her journal about our failures and inadequacies while we worried about her electric bill. I think about how she died believing she was a good person. Sometimes I wonder if she ever felt guilty. If there were moments late at night when she questioned what she was doing to us. If she ever considered that her test was really just elaborate torture disguised as love. But then I remember the video messages, her serene certainty that she'd done the right thing, and I know the answer. Margaret never doubted herself. Never questioned her methods. Never considered that she might be wrong. She died as delusional as she'd lived. The hardest lesson I've learned is that some betrayals can't be forgiven, shouldn't be forgiven, don't deserve forgiveness. Margaret stole decades from our lives, opportunities from our children, peace from our family. She did it deliberately, systematically, with full knowledge of the pain she was causing. And she did it while accepting our love, our money, our genuine concern for her welfare. That kind of cruelty doesn't earn forgiveness. It earns grief for the person we thought we knew and contempt for the person she actually was. But we've also learned something else. We're stronger than we thought. We survived 23 years of manipulation and emerged with our love for each other intact. We've learned to trust again, carefully and deliberately but genuinely. Margaret wanted to teach us about character. She succeeded, just not in the way she intended. She taught us that real character means choosing love over control, honesty over manipulation, generosity over self-righteousness. She taught us what we never want to become. I'm 54 years old now, and I've learned to live with both the love and the rage, the grief and the anger, the betrayal and the healing. Some days are harder than others. Some days I still catch myself shaking with fury at what she took from us. But most days I focus on what we built in spite of her. The children who learned resilience not from artificial struggle but from real love. The marriage that survived the ultimate test of trust. The family that chose truth over comfortable lies. We are not who Margaret wanted us to be. We are better. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this road with me. I hope this story gives you strength, or at least the feeling that you're not alone. Comment where you're watching from and maybe subscribe. Let's build a place where voices like mine, and maybe even yours, are finally heard.